He bought a rundown livery stable for 17 cents. 3 sisters slept in the hayloft. The 17 cents were in my left shirt pocket when I signed the deed. Dimas Holt, the land agent, laid the paper on the counter and looked at me the way a man looks at someone who has lost his reason. Maybe I had. The stable was a wreck. Half the roof was bad shingles and half was sky. The south wall leaned like a drunk against the corral post. There were swallows nesting in the tack room and a smell in the stalls that told me the last animal to sleep there had been dead some time before it left. I pressed my thumb to the ink block and made my mark. Dimas said, "Mr. Cord, I feel obliged to tell you that 3 women have been sleeping in that loft for the past 6 nights. He said it quietly, the way you tell a man something he won't want to hear. "Orphaned sisters. Oldest one came in from Cheyenne looking for work. I don't know their business exactly." I folded my copy of the deed and put it in my coat. "Is that a problem for you, Dimas?" He spread his hands. "It ain't my stable anymore." I walked the 3 blocks back up Calhoun Street with the morning sun behind me, and my shadow stretched out long ahead. That was the 22nd of April, 1889. I had 41 years on me, both knees sore from winters spent laying rail in Wyoming cold, and I had come to a town called Cutter's Ford with the idea of building something with my hands that wasn't someone else's railroad. I had $212 in my boot, a canvas bag of tools, and now a crumbling livery stable that came with 3 women already living in it. I'm not going to tell you I had any particular plan for what happened next. I'm going to tell you what I did, which is all I know how to do. I want to say something about how I came to Cutter's Ford, since I've started telling you this, and I might as well tell it right. I'd worked for the Central Wyoming Railroad for 11 years, starting as a laborer and ending as a foreman over a crew of 40 men on the northern spur. I was good at the work. I knew timber and grade and the way the ground behaves when the frost gets into it, and the way it behaves when the frost comes out. I knew how to read a foreman's plat, and I knew, more importantly, how to read the land itself, the places where it was going to push back and the places where it was going to let you through. But 11 years of working for someone else's railroad had made one thing plain. Everything I built was theirs. I'd wake up in the morning and look at track I'd laid and think, "That's good work," and then I'd think, "That's Harmon Pike's track." Harmon Pike being the man who owned the Northern Division and had never swung a hammer in his life. Never had his hands in that cold. Never had his back to the wind at 4 in the morning trying to get a splice done before it froze solid. There is a particular thing that happens to a man who does good work for someone else for long enough. He starts to feel like the work isn't quite real, or like he isn't quite real, one or the other. Like he's a tool being used. Which is true, except that tools don't know it. I knew it. So in the spring of 1889, when Harmon Pike decided to reroute the northern spur on account of a mineral survey he'd had done, and 6 of my best men lost their positions, and I was offered the foreman job on the rerouted line, which meant I would have to lay those 6 off myself, which I was not going to do. I handed in my papers and walked out of Cheyenne with what I'd saved and a clear idea of what I wanted. I wanted something mine. I didn't know it would be a livery stable in a town I'd never heard of. I'd come to Cutter's Ford because a man on the stage had mentioned it had no decent stable and a growing cattle trade, and that sounded like the arithmetic I was looking for. I'd bought the worst building in town for everything in my pocket and a promise to pay the remainder over 6 months. $212 left, tools, 2 good hands and the knowledge of how to use them. And a crumbling stable with 3 women in the loft. I had $41 left over after the deal was done, had to pay Gebhardt's first delivery out of the boot money, and the saddle soap and the new hinges and a week's food. So maybe not 41, 38. But I had the deed and I had the tools and I had the work in front of me, which is all a man needs to start. I want to say something about 41, about what it is to be 41 years old and starting over. I had been a good foreman. I had been, by most measures of the life I'd been living, a successful man. I had earned a wage that was fair and spent it mostly on tools and saved the rest and not gambled it away or drunk it away or made any of the mistakes that take a man's money in rail camps, where the opportunities for mistakes are considerable. I had good hands and a sound back mostly, and a head that understood construction. What I had not had was anything that was mine. A man my age starting over in a broken-down building with $38 and a canvas bag of tools looks, to most observers, like a man who has failed. That is the most common interpretation. What he is, in fact, is a man who has decided to stop building on someone else's land. Those are not the same thing, though they can look alike from the outside. I understood that I was betting on myself. That was the honest description of what I was doing. I was saying, the only thing I trust to treat my work as mine is me, so I will work for me. The stable was the test. It was a test I was fairly confident I could pass, given enough time and enough timber and enough mornings getting up before the light. What I was not confident about and had not thought much about was the rest of it, the part that turned out to be 3 women in the loft. You cannot plan for that. You can only decide what to do when it's in front of you. The loft ladder was inside the main doors. I came in, set my bag down in the dirt, and looked up. There was a face at the edge of the loft, a young girl, maybe 11, watching me with the exact expression of a cat deciding whether to run. Behind her, just shapes in the shadow. "Morning," I said. The girl didn't answer. I walked to the nearest stall, ran my hand along the post. The wood was soft with rot in the bottom 2 feet but good above. I pulled out my knife and dug into it, checking the depth of the damage. I was doing that, back turned to the loft, when I heard someone come down the ladder. She didn't make much sound doing it. I turned around and there was a woman about my height, maybe 30 or a little short of it, in a gray dress that had been washed so many times it was more the memory of a dress than a dress. Dark hair pinned back. Jaw set like she'd been setting it for weeks and was used to the weight. She said we didn't have anywhere else. I said I figured. We haven't taken anything. I can see that. There was a silence. She was looking at me the way people look at a problem they're trying to understand fast, measuring whether I was the kind of trouble that shouts or the kind that goes quiet first. I said, "What's your name?" "Nora Vass. My sisters are Calla and Rue. Calla's the one you saw. Rue's sick. She's been sick since we got here." "How sick?" "Fever, the kind that comes and goes. She's sleeping." I nodded. I put my knife away. "I need to fix this stable. That's what I'm here to do. I'll need to work in the loft eventually, but not today. Today I'm pulling the south wall and relaying the posts." She watched me a moment longer, then she said, "What do you need us to do?" That stopped me. I had expected her to ask how long she had before I put them out. That was the expected question, and I'd been turning over an answer to it on the walk over. What she asked instead was different. I said, "Nothing right now. You've got a sick sister, see to her." She kept looking at me. "I mean it," I said. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you until the little one's well." The first week, I took the south wall apart post by post. It's slow work, pulling a wall that isn't sound, because you never know which piece is holding the one above it, and you don't want the whole thing coming down on your head. I worked from the bottom, knocked loose the rot, tested each piece. The good timber I set aside. The bad timber I burned. It makes for a slow fire, wet rot timber, but it burns. Nora came out the first afternoon and watched for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "What are you going to do for new posts?" I told her I'd have to haul timber from a mill I'd seen on the road north of town. She said, "They overcharge. There's a man named Gebhardt on the East Road, 3 miles out, who sells timber. He's not much for talking, but his prices are fair." I looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Calla told me. She goes around." Calla being 11 years old, and having apparently walked the roads around Cutters for the way a scout walks new territory. I asked if Calla was all right walking 3 miles on her own. Nora said she'd been walking on her own since she was 6, without any particular emphasis on it, which told me most of what I needed to know about their history without telling me any of it. I went to Gebhardt the next day. He was everything Nora had said, a square, quiet man who said almost nothing and charged almost nothing, and his timber was good. I came back with a wagon load and the work picked up. By the end of the first week, I had new posts set in the ground. By the end of the second, the south wall was up and plumb. I stood back and looked at it in the evening light, hands raw, cramp in my back that had been there since Tuesday, and I thought, that's mine. Nobody else's name on that wall. Mine. There is a satisfaction in that I cannot adequately describe. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits in the place behind your sternum and holds. The second week was when I started to understand the 3 sisters, as individuals rather than as a group. Calla I've started to tell you about. She was what you might call ungovernable in the best possible sense. She had decided what she was interested in and pursued it without asking anyone's permission, and what she was interested in was horses. She would come into the stable before I was up, which in those weeks was before 5, just to look at whatever animals were in the stalls. She didn't touch them without asking. That was the discipline underneath the wildness. She had manners where they mattered, and no patience for them where they didn't. On the third day she came to me while I was working and said, "The bay in the second stall has something wrong with his near foreleg." I went and looked. She was right. The horse was a boarder, a rancher's animal, and it was favoring it just slightly, the way a horse will when something's starting rather than established. I told the owner when he came by that evening. He looked at the leg, looked at me, looked at Calla standing off to one side pretending not to be listening. He said, "Your girl catch that." I said she did. He didn't say much more, but he added 50 cents to his boarding payment. I gave it to Calla, and she looked at it a long time before she folded it into her pocket. Rue was the one I knew least in those early weeks, because she was sick. The fever that came and went was some kind of respiratory ailment she'd picked up on the road from Cheyenne, and it had settled in and was taking its time leaving. She slept a great deal. When she was awake, she sat in the loft or later on a crate near the tack room door and watched things, and she had the look of someone who was not missing anything even when she appeared to be doing nothing. She was 14. She had a book with a broken cover that she wrote in. Small, the fever had made her smaller, and she had eyes that were the exact same dark shade as Nora's and the same quality of steadiness in them. You could see the family there. The fever broke the 6th night. I knew because Nora came to the tack room door early in the morning and knocked, which she had never done before. I came out and she said, "The fever's gone." And the way she said it, the flatness of it, the deliberate no expression of it, told me she'd been carrying that worry for a long time and had not let herself believe it was going to end until it had. I said, "Good." And then, because she was still standing in the door with that look, I said, "You must be tired." She said, "I can sleep now." And that was all, and she went back up the ladder. Here is what the town made of us in those early weeks, and here is what it decided. The town saw a lone man who had bought the worst property on Calhoun Street and was doing something to it. The town saw 3 young women, one very young, living in the same property. Towns always need to make sense of what they see, and when they can't do it fairly, they do it in whatever way costs them the least thought. The Gem Saloon settled on the story that I had taken up with the 3 women. Petties decided the women were an encumbrance I was too soft to clear out. The dressmakers on Front Street, I found out much later, had settled on the story that the oldest one had her hooks in a working man, which was so backward from the truth I almost laughed when I heard it. None of it mattered to me. I had worked 11 years for a man who paid my wages and meant it when he said I was capable and still didn't know my last name without checking a paper. The opinions of Cutters Ford were not my concern. What I was doing was building a stable. By the end of May, I had my first 2 paying boarders, a pair of horses belonging to the Rourke and Blend freight outfit that ran supply wagons between town and the mining camps up toward the pass. Rourke himself came to inspect before he committed. He walked the stalls, looked at the feed, pressed his thumb against the new post in the south wall the way I'd pressed mine when I was checking for rot, and got nothing back, which is what you want. He said, "You do this work yourself." I said I did. "How long you been in the trade?" 2 months, I said. He was quiet a moment. He looked at Calla, who was in the far stall laying feed with the gravity of someone twice her age. He said, "She tell you about my wheel horse?" I said she had. "I didn't believe her," he said. "I believed her this morning when we were 3 miles out and I had to pull him." He paused. "Better 3 miles than 30. I'll know to listen next time." He put out his hand and we settled on a number that was fair to both of us and shook on it. When he left, I turned around and Calla was at the end of the aisle watching me. I said, "Good work on the wheel horse." She said he should have listened sooner. "They usually should," I said. "Doesn't mean you stop telling them." She thought about it, nodded, and went back to the feed. The first time I saw Nora laugh was in June. I want to tell you about it because it matters. There was a man named Aldous Fitch who had a mule he wanted to board while he traveled east. The mule was called Josephine, though I doubted any self-respecting mule would answer to it, and Josephine did not want to come into the stable. She had opinions about it, expressed in the usual mule fashion. Aldous was pulling and cajoling and making promises she clearly had no interest in, and I came out to help, and between the 2 of us we were making no progress at all. Calla came out of the stable, walked past both of us, held out her hand to Josephine with something in it. I think a piece of dried apple from her pocket, and Josephine walked in after her like she'd been doing it every day of her life. I looked at Aldous. Aldous looked at me. Nora was in the stable doorway, and she made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the thing right before one. Then she turned away and went inside, and I could see from the set of her shoulders that she was laughing, and was trying not to let Aldous Fitch know she was laughing at his expense. Later, after Aldous had gone, I came into the tack room, and Nora was there doing the accounts, and she looked up at me, and we were quiet for a moment, and then she laughed for real. Short, clean, like a bell. She looked surprised by it herself, which I found interesting. I said, "When did you last do that?" She thought about it. "I don't remember," she said. That answer stayed with me. The roof had needed doing since May, but May had been about the walls and the floor and the stalls. I got to the roof in June, and it was a two-person job, which is when Nora came out the second morning and said she knew how to hold shingles and pass nails. She wasn't wrong. She came up and worked without complaint and without chatter, and she learned the rhythm quick, which piece you pull next, how you hold the shingle while the nail goes in, the way you move across a pitched surface without thinking about it. You develop a feel for the angles. Nora developed it inside an hour, which told me something about the kind of attention she paid to things. At noon, she climbed down and came back up with 2 biscuits wrapped in a cloth, handed me one and sat down beside me, and we ate looking out over the town. That was the first time I'd seen Cutter's Ford from above. It was small and dusty and mostly unglamorous, the way most real places are. But the valley past the main street was good grass, dark green even in June, fed by the creek that came down from the pass, and I said so. Nora said, "Calla says there's 3 cattle ranches to the east. She gets around." "How's Rue?" "Better this week." She was quiet a moment. "We owe you." I said, "You've been working your passage." She looked at me. "You didn't ask us to." "No," I bit into the biscuit. "Somebody had put a little sage in it, good bread. But you did." She didn't say anything else to that. We went back to the roof. I want to tell you about that afternoon on the roof, because I understood something up there that I hadn't understood before. I had come to Cutter's Ford to build something mine. The plan I'd laid out in my head on the stage from Cheyenne was clear and simple. The stable would be mine, the work would be mine, the result would belong to me in the way that nothing I'd built on Pike's Railroad ever had. Clean and simple and solitary. What I had not included in that plan was anyone else. Not from selfishness exactly, more from habit. A man who has been alone long enough stops imagining company into his plans. He adapts to the not having and mistakes the adaptation for preference. Nora sat on my roof eating biscuits she'd made and said, "Calla says there's 3 cattle ranches to the east." She was paying attention to the valley. She was already building a map of it in her head. She was planning to be here. I went back to work and did not think about this consciously for several months. But something shifted up on that roof, the way things shift underground before you see the effect on the surface, slow and quiet and absolutely certain. I should tell you about the night in June. That was when things moved, and not in the way I'd expected. The Vass girl's father had died in a rail accident outside Cheyenne the previous November. I'd known that from early on. What I hadn't known was that there had been a man named Pell Gruder, a crew foreman at the yards, who had been pressing Nora since before her father was in the ground. He had a story about a debt her father had left, the details of which shifted every time he told it, which told you everything about the debt. He had been pressing her for money and for other things, the other things stated without being named, the way a woman has to talk about that kind when she doesn't want to make it worse by naming it. They'd left Cheyenne in part to get away from Gruder. He had followed them. I found out when I came in late from a hauling job, a lumber delivery for a building going up on the north end of town, first outside work I'd taken to build up the account. I came in past 10, smelling like pine sap and horse sweat, and Calla met me just inside the main doors. She said, in the voice of someone who has decided calm is the right tool for this, "There's a man in the loft with Nora." I went to the ladder. He was a thick man, Gruder. The kind of man who has always been the largest person in the rooms he walked into and has organized his understanding of himself around that fact. He was sitting on the edge of a crate in the loft with his hat on and his coat buttoned, and Nora was standing against the far beam with Rue behind her. The look on Nora's face was not fear exactly. She was past fear, I thought, or had put it somewhere she could find it later. It was more the look of someone enduring something they've had to endure before and know they can probably endure again, and are deciding whether there is any point in objecting. That look, more than anything else about that moment, told me about Nora Vass, about what her life had been. I said, "Get out." Gruder looked at me with the calculation of a man accustomed to being the largest presence. He said something about a debt, and about how this was no business of mine, and I let him finish, because it gave me a useful picture of how his mind worked. Then I said, "This is my stable and my loft, and those women are my people, and you have 10 seconds to get your boots off my ladder, or I'm going to make the rest of the night something you'd rather not remember." There's a kind of man who hears that and decides to test it. Gruder was not quite that man. He stood, adjusted his coat, looked at Nora with something I will not describe, and went down the ladder. I followed him to the main doors and stood in the street until he turned the corner at Petty's. When I came back inside, Nora was at the bottom of the loft ladder, hands at her sides. The set of her jaw was the same as always, but there was something just around her eyes that hadn't been there that morning. Not softness, exactly. More like the slight release of a thing that had been held very tight. She said, "He'll come back." I said, "I know. You don't have to." "Nora," I said it plain, "go to sleep, I'll be in the tack room. He comes back tonight, he'll hear about it." She looked at me a long time, then she said, "Thank you, Eli." It was the first time she'd used my name. I noticed that. Gruder came back twice more that summer. I won't spend too long on it. The second time, I had company I hadn't arranged for. Rourke had heard something in town and showed up that evening with 2 of his drivers on no particular pretext. Just 3 men checking a hinge on the corral gate that didn't need checking. Gruder saw them from the street and kept walking. The third time I handled alone. He came in the afternoon when the women were in town. He started in on the debt story again, and I let him get a few sentences in. Then I said, quietly, without raising my voice, "You're not getting anything from those women. Not money, not anything else. You come here again, I'm going to the sheriff with the debt that changes every time you tell it, and the story of how you followed 3 women from Cheyenne. And then I'm going to tell Rourke, who tells the freight bosses, and work in this valley gets short for a man with your history. This is the last visit. Go." He went. I don't know whether it was what I said, or whether he'd moved along to his next idea of easy money. Men like Gruder are persistent until they meet something that costs more than they're willing to spend. Rourke had said to me after the second visit, still working that gate pin in and out, "You've made some friends in this town you didn't know you had." I thought about that. I hadn't gone looking for friends. I'd gone looking for paying boarders and sound timber. But a man who does his work and stands up when standing up is called for draws a certain kind of person toward him, and that is not the worst thing. By October, I had 8 regular boarders, a waiting list of 2, and had hired a boy named Thatch to help with the heavy days. The stable was sound. The south wall I'd rebuilt in April had settled into the ground the way good work settles, like it had always been there and couldn't imagine being anywhere else. I walked the whole thing one October morning just to look at it. The aisle, the posts, the roof, the tack room, the corral, a habit I had, looking for what still needed doing. There is always something. But that morning I let myself look at what was done. $212 and a canvas bag of tools, 6 months, a stable that was not only standing but doing business, a waiting list. There's a thing a man feels when he has built something and watched it prove itself. Not the feeling right after when you're tired and your hands hurt. Later, when the first hard rain comes and the roof holds, when the first hard freeze comes and the pipes don't burst, when the horses are settled and the stalls are full and the accounts show a number that goes the right direction. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like proof. Proof of something you suspected about yourself that you couldn't verify until the work tested it. I had suspected I could do this. The work had proven it. I want to tell you about the summer, the full summer, because the summer was when the stable became real to the town, and real to me in ways the building of it hadn't been. Rourke and Blend's 2 horses became 4 by July, and 4 became 7 by August, when the freight runs to the pass were at their heaviest, and Rourke needed animals rested and ready at all times. He ran his wagons hard, the way freight outfits do, and he needed a livery he could count on to do more than keep the horses alive. He needed them kept right, which is a different thing. An animal that's kept alive and an animal that's kept right are not the same animal. and every man who runs freight over mountain roads knows it. I kept them right. Calla kept them right, which meant that Rourke's animals came in tired from the pass and went out a day or two later rested and sound, and he lost fewer loads than any freight outfit on the eastern road that summer. He told me that once, in the way of a man reporting a fact rather than paying a compliment, which is the way of the kind of compliment that means something. Word moved the way word does. By July, 2 other outfits were asking about space. By August, I had the waiting list, and I had built a reputation I had not set out to build but had apparently built anyway, one sound horse at a time. There is something I want to say about reputation, because I spent a long time in rail camps where a man's reputation was a thing he worked at, polished, defended. Some men built a reputation by being loud about their competence. Some built it by making sure the right people saw the right things at the right time. I had never been good at either of those. What I knew how to do was the work, and let the work say what it was going to say. The work said what it needed to say, that's all. Nora noticed. She said to me one evening in August, going over the accounts, "You know Petty's has changed its story about you." I said, "Has it?" Souls was in there last week. He says they're calling you Solid now, instead of whatever they were calling you in April. I said I didn't know what they'd been calling me in April. "I do," she said, and left it there, which was Nora's way of telling me without making me hear the detail. I said, "Solid's good enough." She looked up at me. "More than enough," she said, and went back to the numbers. Nora had found work at the dressmaker's on Front Street. She had done that work in Cheyenne, and she was good at it. And Mrs. Halloran, who ran the shop, cared about stitches and seams more than gossip, which suited them both. Calla had become, without anyone deciding it would happen this way, the stable's horse assessor. Rourke was paying her a small fee to look at animals before he bought them for the freight line. She was 12, and she did the assessments with a seriousness that stopped most men in their tracks. A small girl with dark hair and her sister's jaw, telling a rancher his roan gelding was favoring the left foreleg at the trot. Most of them listened. That's what she had beyond the eye. She said a thing plainly with certainty, and people tended to believe her. Souls, the cattle buyer who wintered in town, came in regularly to check on his matched bays. He was a serious man about horses, and he respected that Calla knew what she was doing. One afternoon in November he said to me without preamble, "That girl is going to be somebody in this valley." I said, "She already is." He looked at me reassessing something, then nodded and let it stand. Rue had taken over the stable's accounts by October. She'd shown me in September her broken-covered book spread on the workbench, numbers laid out in the neat hand of someone who takes numbers seriously. I was not a bad accountant. She was better. She saw the shape of the money, not just what came in and out, but the patterns, where the lean months were, where money that looked like profit was actually needed later. I recognized the skill because I had enough of it to know what better looked like. I told her the accounts were hers if she wanted them. She looked at me the same way Calla had looked at the 50-cent piece, as if she wasn't used to being given something and wasn't quite sure yet what to do with it. "All right," she said, and that was that. "There is something I want to say about the 4 of us together, because I've been giving you events and I want to give you the texture." By November, we had a shape to our days. The morning walk-through, me through one side of the stable, Nora through the other, Calla wherever she felt most useful, Rue doing the morning numbers at the tack room bench by lamplight before the sun came up properly. The rhythm of water and feed. The sounds a stable makes when it's working. The smell of it, hay and horses and leather and cold air coming under the door. I had been a long time alone before Cutter's Ford. Not unhappily. I can be comfortable in my own company for a long stretch. But there is a particular quiet that settles into a man who has been alone long enough, a quiet that after a while he stops noticing because it's always there. Like a sound you hear every day until you don't hear it anymore. I had stopped hearing it. Nora woke it up. Not by doing anything dramatic, just by being a person with a mind and a will and opinions she didn't keep to herself. She had told me in September that my stall arrangement was inefficient, shown me with a stick drawn through the dirt of the aisle how I could run 8 horses through the morning feeding in 20 minutes instead of 35. She was right, and I changed it. She had told me the hay supplier on the North Road was selling short weight. She was right, and I found a new supplier. She told me in October that Thatch needed to be paid more if I wanted to keep him through winter, which I had been thinking but not saying. I am a man who can admit when he is wrong. I find it is generally less costly than people expect. And there was this. One evening in late October, I came in from a job and sat on the tack room step because my right knee had decided to give me the full accounting of every winter it had known, and Nora came and sat beside me without asking and without speaking. She didn't ask what was wrong, didn't offer help I hadn't asked for, didn't make anything of it, just sat there until the knee settled and I could stand up again. Then she went inside and I went inside and neither of us mentioned it. I thought about that evening for a long time afterward. The conversation happened on the 4th of November. I know the date because it snowed that night, the first real snow of the season, and I have always been able to locate that night on the map of my life with no trouble. We'd been closing up the stable together, which had become a habit neither of us had proposed. Just a thing we'd drifted into, the last walkthrough of the evening, checking horses, checking latches. Calla and Rue were already inside. Thatch had gone home an hour earlier. The snow started while we were inside, and we didn't know it until Calla came running in from the back room to tell us. Her voice pitched the way it got when she was genuinely surprised by something. We went to the main doors and pulled them open and looked out. It was coming down steady and soft, piling on the corral posts, making the street quiet the way snow does in a town, muffling the saloon sounds, quieting the horses at the hitching rail, generally pulling everything down toward itself. The mountains to the west had gone white above the tree line. Calla stood between us for a few minutes, confirmed that snow was indeed happening, and went back inside, the way she did with things. Nora and I stayed. After a while she said, "Eli, yeah, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it straight." "All right. Do you want us here?" I looked at her. The snow was doing what snow does. I said, "Nora, I bought this stable with 17 cents in my pocket. You and your sisters have worked alongside me every day since April. The stable's sound. The accounts are good. Calla knows every horse that's come through this valley, and Rue's numbers are better than mine ever were. I would be a poor excuse for a man if I said I didn't want that." She shook her head, small and certain. "That's not what I'm asking." I was quiet a moment. "No," I said, "it isn't." Snow fell. I said, "I want you here the way a man who's been a long time alone wants something that feels like it was supposed to be there all along and didn't know what was missing until it arrived." I said it plain, because that was the only honest shape of it. She was quiet for a moment, looking out. Then she said, "I came to this town with nothing and 2 sisters who needed me to hold it together. I didn't have room to think about anything else. That was all there was." She stopped. "And then you were just—" She stopped again. "Just what?" I said. "You were just there every morning, solid. Like the stable was going to be all right because you'd decided it was, and everything in it was going to be all right for the same reason." She turned and looked at me. "I'm not good at saying things." "You're doing fine," I said. She looked out at the snow. Her shoulder was against mine. "I don't want to leave," she said. "I want you to know that I want." She paused a third time, and then she said it. "I want you to know that I see you, what you are, not what you could be useful for, not what's convenient, what you are." That hit me somewhere low and still. I had been a railroad man for 15 years. I had laid track in whether that would kill a man who wasn't paying attention, done good work 100 times, seen it credited to someone else's name. And I had never, not once in all of it, had anyone say to me what Nora Vass said to me on the 4th of November in the doorway of my stable, with the first snow of the season coming down. I put my hand over hers on my arm and held it there. We didn't say much else. We stood until it was too cold to keep standing, and then she went inside and I went inside, and I lay on my cot in the tack room with the snow still falling outside and something in my chest that had been quiet for so long I'd forgotten its name. Here is what the winter was. We ran the stable through together, the 4 of us and Thatch. Cold made everything harder in the ways cold always does, water freezing in the pipe before you got to it, horses restless, every job taking twice as long and yielding half as much. I'd laid rail in Wyoming cold, and it was preparation enough for most of it, but some of those January mornings were a true test. Nora left the dressmakers in late November when the shop slowed and threw herself into the stable work and the accounts full time. She was better at the accounts than I was, which I've said, but she was also better at certain kinds of judgment, the kind that involves watching several things at once and knowing which one was going to become a problem before it did. I asked her once how she knew. She said she didn't know how she knew, she just watched long enough and the watching taught her. That is the honest answer to most knowledge of that kind. Thatch stayed through the winter, and I raised his pay in December, as Nora had told me to do in October. He was good work and a quiet one, and he had a particular gift for being in the right place without being told, which is rarer than it sounds. Calla assessed horses through the winter for Rourke and for 2 other outfits that had heard about her by word of mouth, which is how it goes when you're good at something. The word travels without you telling it to. She was 12, and she walked into a rancher's corral and looked at an animal with those steady eyes, and said what she saw, and was right often enough that the ranchers stopped arguing with her and started expecting to be told what they'd missed. Rue kept the accounts and kept her lists, and somewhere in December she started keeping a separate record of every horse that came through, names, conditions, what work was done, what Calla had noted, what feed they took. She called it the horse ledger. Rourke borrowed it once to settle a dispute about when a particular animal had last been shod. Afterward, he told me he'd never seen a livery operation keep records like that. I said Rue had her own ideas about what needed tracking. He said, good ideas. January brought a stretch of days, so cold the thermometer on the post outside the main doors read things I won't repeat. You do what you do in cold like that. You wear everything you own, you keep the horses moving, you check the water twice as often as seems necessary. We lost a boarder in late January, an old mare named Freckle belonging to a widow named Mrs. Dees who had a small spread east of town. Freckle went down in the night and didn't come back up, which is how it happens with old animals sometimes. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way a thing that has run a long time finally stops. I went in the morning and found her. I waited and sent Thatch to get Calla and to get Mrs. Dees. Calla came in and looked at Freckle for a long time without saying anything. Then she went outside, which I respected, and I let her be. Mrs. Dees was dry-eyed about it, the way older women often are, the way of someone who has been through enough loss that she knows how to carry this one. She thanked me for the care and meant it. I told her Freckle had been content, and I meant that. After Mrs. Dees left, I went out to the corral. Calla was in the far corner, back to me, looking at nothing in particular. I got a piece of wood from the pile and came back inside, and when she came in 20 minutes later, the fire was going in the tack room stove, and the coffee was on. She sat down on the bench and wrapped her hands around a cup and didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything either. Some things you do without saying. Calla had understood that from the first morning, when she'd watched me from the loft and made her calculation about whether I was safe. I think what she'd been calculating was whether I was the kind of man who needed everything said out loud, and she'd concluded I wasn't, and she'd been right. There was an evening in February, a Tuesday, I think, that I want to tell you about because it is one of the clearest memories I have of that winter, and I'm not sure I can tell you exactly why. Thatch had gone home. The horses were settled. The cold outside was the kind that makes the air in a closed room feel like something you're grateful for. The 4 of us were in the tack room, me at the bench with a piece of harness I was repairing, Rue at the other end with her ledgers, Nora in the chair by the stove doing needlework she'd brought from the shop, Calla on the floor with her back against the wall doing nothing in particular, which was rare enough that I'd noticed it. Nobody was talking. There was the sound of the fire in the stove, the occasional shift of a horse in the stall beyond the wall, the small scratch of Rue's pen. Calla said, without any particular lead-in, I'm going to have my own horses someday. Nobody answered right away. Then Rue said, without looking up from the ledger, you'll need capital. Calla considered that. How much? Depends what kind of horses and how many, Rue said. What kind? Calla thought about it with the seriousness she brought to everything. Working stock first, then breeding. Rue wrote something down. Starting capital for working stock at current prices, figure 3 to 5 years savings if you're drawing the rate you're drawing now from Rourke, less if the rate goes up. Calla looked at her sister. Will it go up? Rue looked at me. I said, if you keep being right, it'll go up. Calla nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected, and went back to doing nothing, which apparently she found satisfying. I looked at Nora. She was looking at her needlework, but there was something in the set of her face that I recognized by then, the slight softening around the jaw that she got when something had pleased her, and she wasn't going to say so out loud. I went back to the harness. The fire burned, Rue's pen scratched, the horse shifted in the stall. I want to leave that evening on the page because it is what I mean when I say the winter was good. Not a dramatic thing. Just 4 people in a warm room with the cold outside. Each one doing their part, each one knowing the others were there. And nothing needing to be said about any of it because it was all understood. That is what a life built right feels like from inside it. I want you to know that. March came in with the smell of cold water and dirt, which is the best smell in the world if you've spent a winter in Wyoming, and I have spent more than one. The grass at the valley floor showed through the snow in patches. The light changed. The horses knew it before we did. I was pacing out the dimensions for the East Edition one morning. More stall space. A larger tack room, a space that could double as an office for the accounts. I was counting off the feet on the east side of the stable when Nora came out. She watched me pace for a moment. Then she said, "You're thinking 12 feet. I said 14. She thought about it. 14's better. You could fit 2 more stalls and not feel crowded. That was how most of our conversations went. Functional, moving forward, no wasted space. I had always liked that about talking with her. She didn't talk to fill silence. She talked when she had something to say. I turned around and looked at the stable from outside. The repaired south wall, the new corral gate, the roof I'd put on in stages over the summer and fall. Nora was standing a few feet away, looking at the same thing. I said, "What do you see when you look at it?" She thought about the question. "Work," she said, "but not the way I used to see work, not something that needs doing, something that got done." That was the right answer. She said without looking at me, "Will you marry me, Eli?" I stood there. She said, still looking at the stable, "I know that isn't how it's supposed to go. I know I'm supposed to wait for you to ask. But I've spent enough of my life waiting for men to decide what was going to happen to me, and I'd rather ask." I said yes. She turned then. There was something in her face I hadn't seen before. Not relief exactly. More the laying down of something she'd been carrying, not the weight of trouble, but the weight of wanting something and not knowing if it was going to be given. "Yes," she said. "Yes," I said. "I've been working up to asking you since November." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Why didn't you?" "Because you asked first," I said. "Which is better?" She put her forehead against my chest, right at the 3rd button of my shirt, and I put my arm around her, and we stood like that with the morning cold around us and the horses watching from their stalls, patient as horses always are with the things people get up to. I am not going to tell you it felt like I thought it would feel, because I hadn't let myself think about how it would feel. What it was, solid, like the last piece of something going into its right place and everything holding. We were married in May, on a Saturday, in the stable itself. Nora said she wanted to be married where she'd worked, and I thought that was exactly right. Pastor Grise had his reservations about the venue and expressed them to his pew and then came anyway, because a wedding is a wedding, and I think under the reservations he was a decent man. Rourke came, and his drivers, and Souls the cattle buyer, and Mrs. Dees, who wept through most of the ceremony in a way that I don't think had everything to do with us, but which was genuine. Gebhardt, who had sold me most of my timber and who I had never heard say a sentence longer than 6 words, came in a coat he wore twice a year at most, and stood in the back and nodded at the right moments. Calla stood up straight and serious in a green dress Nora had made for her. Rue had her little book and was writing something in it during the ceremony. I never asked what. She was 15 by then, and whatever she was putting in that book during our wedding was her own business. I remember the light in the stable that morning. The main doors opened, the May sun coming in from the east, horses in the stalls behind us settled and quiet. The smell of the place, hay, leather, the particular wood smoke smell that had gotten into the beams over the winter and would never fully leave. My stable, my work, my life, it turned out. Dimas Holt came by afterward to sign paperwork about the East Edition. He looked at Nora, at the stable, at me, and said, "Mr. Cord, I confess I did not see any of this when you put your thumb to that deed." I said, "Neither did I, Dimas." He laughed, short but real, and I liked him better for it. The stable stood for 30 more years. The East Edition went up that summer, the hay barn the following spring, a second well the spring after that. Rourke and Blen moved all their animal business to us by the end of the 2nd year, and 2 more freight accounts followed. Eventually, I took on a second full-time man alongside Thatch. Calla went to work for Souls when she was 17. She built that into a position that put her name on the county land records 3 times before she was 30. She married a rancher named Aldercott who was smart enough to know what he'd gotten and said so plainly. She came back to Cutter's Ford twice a year and always walked the stable aisle the way she had at 11, directly, looking at what needed looking at. Rue's numbers were so good she went to Denver at 19 and married a bank man and set up his books for him. I heard later that he had figured out quickly that the operation ran on Rue's judgment and had the sense to let it. She wrote letters. She wrote good letters in the same neat hand as the accounts, saying what she had to say and not a word more. Nora and I had a son in the 2nd year, James, who came in big with her eyes and my hands, which is the right combination if you're going to work for a living. And a daughter in the 4th year, Clara, who had the same quality of watching that Rue had had and who became in time a doctor of some repute, though that is a longer story than I have time for here. Cutter's Ford grew up. The railroad came through in the 90s, which I took a particular pleasure in, having laid my share of other men's rail through other men's towns. When the spur station went up, they asked me to help plan the livestock holding area, because I knew animals and I knew construction, and I knew what a building had to be to last in that climate. The young foreman on the job called me sir, the whole time, without being asked to and without being told not to. I thought about that. 41 years old, 17 cents, a broken-down stable. 63 when that foreman called me sir. I want to stay with that for a moment, the sir. I'm not a man who sets much store by how people address him. I have worked alongside men who needed to be called Mr. This or Colonel that to feel their dignity was intact, and I have generally found that the men who need the title the most are the ones who have done the least to deserve it. A title is not the same as respect. I know the difference because I have been given both, and I know which one sits solid and which one doesn't. What the young foreman, sir, was, I want to be clear about this, was not about the word. It was about what was behind it. He was a young man who knew his business, and he called me sir because he recognized that I knew mine and that the knowing came from somewhere real. That's different from politeness. Politeness is easy. Recognition is earned. I had spent 11 years in Wyoming as a man whose name Harmon Pike couldn't keep in his head without a paper. The same work, the same knowledge, the same hands. But it was Pike's railroad, so what the work proved was Pike's judgment in hiring me, not my own judgment in doing the job. On my stable, on my land, with my name on the deed and my posts in the ground and my accounts going the right direction, the work proved mine. That is the difference. Nora understood this. She had lived the other side of it, had been in situations where her competence was taken for granted, and her presence was either invisible or inconvenient. She did not talk about it directly, but I understood it the way you understand things about a person you have worked alongside through a hard winter, by watching how they move through the world and what they reach for when something needs to be done. She reached for the work, always. Whatever needed doing, she did it without waiting to be asked and without needing to be thanked, and in the doing of it she was, I want to find the right word, complete. That's the word. She was complete when she was working, not performing contentment, not making the best of a situation, complete, in her right place. I have thought about that for a long time. About 2 people who were each, separately, suited to the work, to the particular kind of building and maintaining and steadying that a working stable requires, finding each other in the same broken-down building on the same April morning. I don't believe in the kind of fate that arranges things. I believe in the kind of fate that puts 2 people in the same room and lets them decide what to do next. What I decided was to put my knife away and go on working. What Nora decided was to come down the ladder. Everything after that was the 2 of us deciding, every day, the same kind of thing. I am not going to tell you I had it all figured out. I had it worked out, which is different. Working something out is daily. It's the morning walkthrough, the accounts at the bench, the argument about the hay supplier. It's the thing that earns to a conclusion you didn't see when you started. Late in a winter, Calla was gone by then. Rue was in Denver. The children were half grown and making their own ways. Nora and I were at the table in the room behind the tack room. We'd built a proper house by then, but we still sometimes came back to that room because it was the first room that was ours, and we knew its light and its cold. The coffee had gone half cold. The lamp was throwing its yellow light on the wall. Outside, snow was coming down the way it does in that country, steady and indifferent. Nora said, I thought about you that first morning, after I came down the ladder and went back up. I said, "What did you think?" "I thought about whether you were safe." She had her hands around the coffee cup, warming them. "I watched you from above for a while before I came down. You were working on that post with your knife." I remembered that, the rod in the bottom of the post, checking the depth of it. "And you put the knife away," she said. "When you were done with it, you just put it away and went on working, and there was nothing in how you moved that was for me. You weren't performing. You weren't making a show of not being threatening. You were just doing your work." I said, "That's not much to go on." "It was enough," she said. "I knew what it meant. It meant you were what you were, not what you wanted people to see. A man who does his work and puts his tools away when he's done with them." She paused. "That's what I came down the ladder for." I thought about that, about the knife, about a man I'd been on a morning in April with 17 cents in his pocket, working on a post in a broken-down stable, not yet knowing what was in the loft above him. The snow outside made the town quiet. Nora's hands were around the cup. The lamp threw its light on the wall, steady as it always was. I had been a man that nobody in Cheyenne, in 11 years of laying rail, had known by name without checking a paper. I had bought a wreck of a building for the change in my pocket. I had put my knife away when I was done with it, the way you do, the way a man does when he is just himself with no one watching. And a woman had come down a ladder and seen what I was. That's the shape of it, the whole shape. A table in a warm room, cold coffee, lamplight on the wall, horses quiet in the stable outside. Snow coming down over everything, the way it always does, steady and indifferent, and if you're sitting in the right place with the right person, more beautiful than it has any business being. That's where I'll leave it.